Yeah. One of the dumbest things anybody's ever said was this idea that you need to have a certain strength level before you can do plyos. That makes no sense at all. We never did that. Now, I would think there is a requisite or maybe a recommended strength level for really aggressive linear plyometrics, but to look and think the other thing too, and I'll go back a step. I don't think a lot of what we do in the beginning are in fact plyometrics. So if I box jump is probably not truly plyometric. If I'm thinking about plyometric as reacting to the ground, if I'm doing these single responses, then I'm probably just doing power training.
Welcome to the Athletic Edge podcast. I'm your host, Liam Evans, strength and conditioning coach and owner of Evans Performance. This is a podcast tailored for athletes, coaches, and parents interested in every facet of athletic development. Join me and guests from around the world as we dive into game-changing tools and expert insights covering strength training, performance enhancement, and long-term athletic development strategies. Uncover the keys to elevate your athletic potential, drawing from trusted resources to safely and effectively navigate your training and build your athletic edge.
Welcome back to the podcast. Today, I am very lucky to be joined by, honestly, one of strength and conditioning's great coaches, Coach Mike Boyle. Obviously, everybody in the strength conditioning world will know quite a lot about you, but for those that maybe aren't in that world, do you want to give just a quick background on yourself and your business?
So I am 64 years old. I have been involved in strength and conditioning now for it would be 43 years. I have a business. We're a little bit north of Boston called Mike Boyle Strength and Conditioning, where initially we dealt primarily with athletes. Now I would say we do lots of general fitness. We have lots of adult clients, but a large percentage of our business is still young athletes. I spent about 30 years at Boston University as a strength and conditioning coach. And because of the time frame, I was able to dabble in a lot of other places. So I worked for the Boston Bruins while I was at Boston University for about a 10-year stretch from 90 to 99. I worked for the Red Sox in 2012 and 2013. I've worked with our women's Olympic team on and off since 1998. Women's Olympic ice hockey, actually, on and off since 98. So I've been able to have a pretty broad range of experiences
Hmm.
while also opening a for-profit business and spending a significant amount of time in the collegiate area.
Were any of those the athletes that you've had from, when they joined in, let's say, middle school program or anything like that, right up until either college or if they did go on to pro, have you had those athletes that have been with you?
Oh yeah, absolutely. We've had athletes that have gone from our middle school groups all the way through to the
Hmm.
NHL, as a for instance. So yes, I would not say that is unusual anymore.
Yeah, and obviously in you know youth athletic development, LTAD, however you want to say it, there are different models and theories and methodologies and everything. What would you say is your kind of overarching philosophy for youth athletic development?
One of the things we have to realize is that the whole LTAD thing is just really a framework for development of young athletes. And so when you think about the stages of train to train and learn to train and all this stuff, that was just somebody, and I think it was Istvan Bayi, who was a Canadian, just trying to put some kind of framework to this whole thing. So I would say essentially I'm in agreement with it, but I think we look at it as hard and factual as opposed to a framework. So
Hmm.
I do really believe that that first phase is learn to train. I think that's a huge part for kids. They have to learn how to train. There are so many fundamental skills when you're talking about somebody learning how to be competent in the weight room, learning how to jump, learning how to land, learning how to sprint. So there's a lot of learn to train. And then I think they call it train to train, which is sort of the next
Hmm.
stage. So as I said, I'd probably be pretty much in agreement. The thing I don't like about the LTAD stuff, if you look at it closely, I don't like the windows of opportunity thing because I don't think there's any validity to that. I don't believe that kids, if they're not sprinting by a certain age, can't get faster, or some of the other things that they talk about in that LTAD kind of framework. The bottom line on this, as far as I can see, is get your kids started training somewhere around 11, 12, so that they get through the bad part about this is learn to train is the first couple years, whether you start at 11 or start at 18. You're still going
Hmm.
to go through that learn to train stage. The sooner you can get through the learn to train stage and start training, the better the benefit of that is going to be.
Yeah, I was gonna say, so if you have somebody that comes to your essentially program as a 16-year-old, let's say, but has zero training background, are they essentially starting at the same place as a middle schooler coming in? And if so, what are some of those things that they're doing?
They're learning the program because when you think these are all going to be unfamiliar skills to them,
Hmm.
whether it's hang clean or squat or chin up or push up, whatever it is, most of these kids will not have been exposed to that. So yes, I think what we have a huge advantage if we can do this with middle school kids as opposed to trying to do it with high school kids.
Yeah, definitely. Is there any? I know you've talked kind of extensively about your thoughts on testing and different tests and whether it's performance or conditioning tests, all that sort of stuff. Is there any, quote unquote, performance testing that you're doing with any of your athletes?
We do vertical jumps and we do fly tens. And we do those because they're part of the program, but we try to not make them tests. We try to not be in a situation where somebody is getting that as feedback, maybe that's being shared with a parent. Because
Okay,
I think
gotcha.
a lot of that stuff can be really negatively reinforcing. If you're building, I think personally, if you're building your program around testing, your program is going to fail
Hmm.
because most kids do not enjoy testing. Most kids find it really stressful. Most kids find it to be negatively reinforcing. And so people who are really going to be data driven are probably going to be driving their kids right out of their business.
Yeah, I was gonna say you'll have those quote unquote say a testing week or things like that, and you'll see kids that even performance wise they do worse. You saw them do 10 pull-ups the week before, and now they can't do eight or can't do whatever it is, and they do almost get just like in school tests. They get a little bit of that testing anxiety, which is why I think yeah, it does make sense to whether it's
Oh,
vertical jumps or anything or sprinting.
without question. And I think when you start talking about sports and sports performance and things like that, there's already a lot of opportunity for these kids to be getting negative feedback. There are tryouts and there are cuts. And I think that we're
Hmm.
trying to provide an environment that is kind of a judgment free environment. Hey, come here to get better. Don't come
Yeah.
here to be told how much you suck. Don't come here to get negative reinforcement. Come here to get positive reinforcement and to realize that if you do the things that we ask you to do, you'll probably play your sport better.
One thing, and I guess we're in a bit of a similar situation with obviously the business side of things and having to deal with parents. Have you ever run into parents that, essentially want you to give feedback on their kid to show that what you're doing is worth it?
Yes, and we just tell them that this is about learning to train. And so
Hmm.
we we don't the key I think with us with our business is we decided very early on that we were not going to cater to those parents. So if you're that parent who says I want data and I want to know if my kid is improving and I want feedback, we're going to tell you, well, you probably should go someplace else then because we're not going to do that. And I will explain to them my kind of why behind that, and I will explain to them that
Hmm.
hey, I don't think that this is the right environment for a kid to be in. And if they don't like it, they can go someplace else. I have no problem with that. The good thing for us is we've got a really thriving business, so we can afford to not be for everybody.
Yeah, so anyone can essentially weed themselves out if they, don't essentially subscribe to your methodologies, which would be not the smartest thing to do,
Yeah.
but there are parents like that. As far as
There are way too many
conditioning,
parents who think they know more
yeah.
than the coaches. So
Yeah. As far as conditioning goes, obviously, I'm assuming at your facility you don't run any sort of conditioning tests with them, or is that something you deal with clubs separately? How does that work?
again, for kids, I think it's absolutely foolish because what you end up doing, and it's Goodhart's law, where they say when the I guess when the test becomes the desired outcome, then all anybody does is train for the test. And that's not what we want. And truthfully,
Hmm.
I don't care what a kid can do a mile in or the 300-yard shuttle in or any of that stuff, particularly when they're pre-college. I think when it gets to college and kids have conditioning tests that are mandated by their coaches, then we're going to start training for those tests. But for kids that are playing middle school sports or high school sports or whatever it is, we we realize they're probably getting way too much conditioning type stimulus from their practice environment and that we can better dedicate time to lots of other things.
So if you have, say college students coming back for the summer that have a specific conditioning test when they go back, is that something that you're just talking to them about where, look, you have to do this test. We'll help you prepare for it?
That is exactly it. So if someone says, I have to do two 300-yard shuttle runs, okay, we're going to prepare for that. If someone says, I have to run a mile and a half, we're going to
Hmm.
prepare for that. Because in this situation now, part of their evaluation will be based on their performance on the coach's assigned conditioning test. So we have to get ready for that. But we'll also try to, I think, in a lot of ways, counsel them towards the best way to approach that test without getting hurt, without overtraining. So
Hmm.
it's not easy, but we work our way around it.
Do you find a lot of your college kids also have performance tests that they have to do when they go back? Say a squat test or a deadlift or.
I would say I probably 50-50 now, I would
Mhm.
guess. So again, we have to get them ready. It may be a bench press test, it may be a back squat test. And again, you'll come in and see my college group that I train, a lot of the kids back squat because they have to back squat when they get to school. So we have to have them prepared, physically prepared, they have to have been doing that lift, I think, in order to be able to pop back into school. You don't want a kid to not squat for 12 weeks or 14 weeks and then suddenly go back to school and somebody's expecting them to have been squatting. So we kind of break some rules in the process.
Got you. For obviously, you're primarily unilateral when it comes to a lot of the squatting movements and things like that. For those that maybe don't understand why that might be and what the difference between a unilateral squat and a bilateral squat might be, do you want to quickly dive into that?
Yeah, I mean, we really believe in unilateral training. We don't, the only bilateral lift we really do on a consistent basis is trap bar deadlift. And I do like it because I think it's one of the safest bilateral heavy exercises that you can do. We would not bilateral squat at all if we had our choice.
Hmm.
But as I said, some of our collegiate kids are going to bilateral squat. I would much rather. We've gotten pretty good at figuring out what the right loads are, sort of what's strong in a one leg squat, what's strong in a skater squat. And we're trying to push our athletes in that direction. The good thing is, Alex Natera, who is an Australian rules football strength coach over in Australia, has come up with some pretty good data from his force plate studies and basically said that if you can handle 50% of body weight in these unilateral exercises, then you are more than likely a double body weight squatter or their equivalent. And I
Hmm.
think that's for a lot of people, that idea of double body weight squat has been the kind of measuring stick that we would use. So for us, if we have kids who don't have bilateral tests, then we're going to push them towards heavier unilateral work, trying to get them to use an external load. So, as a for instance, if I'm one leg squatting, I've got my son who's 180 pounds. I would like to push him up somewhere around 90 pounds of external load. If you can one leg squat with 90 pounds of external load, you're pretty strong. So, and as I said, if you look at Natera's force plate research, that correlates pretty well to a double bodyweight squat.
What type of progression would you use for a single leg squat?
Same, I think it's the same kind of periodized approach that we'd use. We'd start with 3 sets of 8, and we'd probably start with a, a small external load. We might start with 10 pounds. And then it's the simple 10, 20, 30, and then we'll drop down to sets of 3, and we might jump from 30 to 50. And it's basic progressive resistance exercise. I think we get away from basic progressive resistance exercise too often. And that's probably more problematic.
Is there a if there's an athlete brand new that maybe doesn't have the strength to even single leg squat, are you starting them on a split squat? I know you use like a slide board lunge, things like that, or are those separate in your eyes?
It would depend on the athlete. If I have an athlete, let's just say I have a college athlete, then they probably can one leg squat. It's going to be rare that you're going to get a college athlete. Whereas if we've got our younger kids, our middle school kids, they're going to start at split squat and they're going to progress to one leg squat because one leg squat is probably going to be fairly challenging. But if I have a good high school athlete or a good collegiate athlete, they're probably going to be able to jump into one leg squat right off
Mhm.
the bat.
Got you. And even with I also trap bar with most of my athletes, but I feel like in the strength coach world, even on Twitter, and it could be a crazy place, but a lot of people have been saying that they find the trap bar, hurts their athletes back more than say a conventional deadlift. Have you found that to be the case? And if so, have you just switched to a skater, or how did you go about that?
We do switch to a skater if it hurts their back, but we have found the exact opposite. And sometimes I honestly believe, because let's just say you're a Mark Ripto starting strength kind of person, then you're going to automatically be prejudiced against the trap bar deadlift. I honestly think if someone has a significant number of people that trap bar deadlift is bothering their back, then I would have to look at trap bar deadlift and say they're probably not doing it properly.
Hmm.
They're probably not being strict enough about technique. The other thing I would say though is probably, yeah, it's been quite a while. We switched to high handles on the high handle trap bar. So we do pull from a little higher height all the time. And we have very, very little back pain, significantly less than we ever did when we squatted. But there will be some, and those people will generally transition to skater squats and just not do any bilateral stuff at all, which again, fine with me.
Yeah, yeah, I've found the same thing, and if it hurts for whatever reason, and we can't seem to fix that, then we may as well just switch it to something else. Um,
Right. And that's so common sense, which I
yeah,
don't understand why people fight against that. But there are just too many meatheads in our field. There are just too many people who are uh, I talk about a lot of my talks. They put the what ahead of the how in terms of there are things that they want to do. There are exercises that they want to do. And instead of thinking, not ahead of the how, ahead of the why, excuse me, but instead of looking and saying, okay, why am I squatting? Why am I deadlifting? They're starting at, no, we're all squatting and we're all deadlifting. I'm looking at it and thinking, why? I want to run faster. I want to jump higher. So really that's unilateral strength. So if I don't do any bilateral work, I will be perfectly fine with that.
coming from somebody who grew up, outside of the U.S., and I wasn't really exposed to strength and conditioning until I was playing collegiate sports. Why do you think that is? Is it a U.S. based thing? Is it North America? Like, what is the reason for that? Do you think?
I think the reason is that we all evolved, all of us as strength coaches probably evolved out of one of three disciplines: bodybuilding, powerlifting, or Olympic lifting. Those were generally the people, particularly in my age bracket, who went into strength and conditioning. So your first strength and conditioning coaches came in with a very preconceived bias, and it would be
Hmm.
one of those three. And then there was a huge influence in the whole West Side idea. There was a huge powerlifting influence, probably, I would say, kind of maybe late 80s through the 90s into the 2000s. And the fact of the matter is, people that are doing strength and conditioning are generally the people who really valued strength when they were coming up.
Hmm.
Strength was what set them apart. Maybe strength was what made them feel better psychologically. Maybe strength was what made them perform better than their peers. But we have a very distinct bias towards slow strength and bodybuilding and powerlifting, and to a lesser extent, Olympic lifting.
Hmm.
So I think it's just a matter of people having preconceived notions. The good thing, and I said this in a podcast not too long ago, I think guys like myself and Mark Verstegen, early 2000s, started to really push this idea kind of, and I don't, Mark coined the term performance enhancement specialist. He started to refer to, his employees weren't coaches anymore. They were performance enhancement specialists. And I think we did that. We still use the term coach, but I think we started to change how we were looking at things and started to realize that the goal is not to get athletes. We used to say, oh, get bigger, faster, stronger, right? That was the thing, bigger, faster, stronger. Now I look at it and think maybe the goal is just faster for the vast majority of sports. And it's maybe bigger, maybe stronger if it results in faster, yes. But when you start to get stronger or bigger, and you're not improving your sport performance, then that becomes problematic. I always use the example of everybody's seen the Game of Thrones and everybody's seen the Mountain in Game of Thrones,
Hmm.
who was a really accomplished strongman. But the Mountain was an Icelandic basketball player, was a fairly talented athlete before becoming a strongman. And I always use the example, as he became one of the strongest men in the world, he did not get better at basketball. You did not look at him and think, wow, as he's gained all this strength and as he's gained all this size, he's dominating the Icelandic professional league or whatever he's doing. He's playing in Europe and he's unstoppable. The reality
Hmm.
was he probably was worse at basketball. So I think there is a time where this just unadulterated pursuit of strength becomes more negative than positive.
Yeah, and even so, with it, just hearing all this even brings me back to when I was in college, and I played soccer in college, and half of our team was European international kids who also didn't have much of a background in anything. uh, and I had a great relationship with our strength coach, and he's a great guy and helped me with my career or even start my career. But I just remember having the disconnect between a lot of, say, the Europeans and him, who is, instead of connecting with them, building some buy-in, and why we're doing some of the stuff we are doing is just squat, deadlift, bench, and they're all saying like, what am I doing? How is this going to help me? All this stuff, where yes, it might have helped, but it was just that disconnect between the two of them that I think made it a little bit of a rougher go about it.
Without question, particularly as it relates to men's soccer is a really good example of that in terms
Yeah.
of the male soccer player does not tend to have a lot of role models who excelled in soccer and were big advocates for strength training. I always go back. Salah is a big advocate now
Hmm.
and has had a really great run at Liverpool. Christian Ronaldo, I think, has been a pretty good poster child for strength and conditioning. But in general, there is a built in aversion
Yeah.
in the male soccer world. And that's why you put it perfectly getting buy in. Even when I started working, I probably did it wrong initially in my early years at Boston University because I thought, heck, they all should squat, they all should clean, they all should bench press. Like, what's the big deal?
Yeah.
Just get strong. It's going to help you. But when I started, that's why it's really funny. The unilateral approach sells everywhere except American football.
Yeah.
So if you get anybody from any other sport and you say, "Hey, we're not going to back squat. We're going to do these one leg squats," you get the like big like thumbs up, high five, Mike. You're the man. I love you. If I go and I say that to an American football coach, he thinks you don't know what you're talking about. But in every other sport, if I go to basketball, I go to soccer, I go to lacrosse, wherever it is, and it's kind of interesting. American football and rugby. Rugby has followed American football very closely. And again, they train everybody like they train their big guys up front. And that's what American football has done is that there are certain guys who are very geared toward weightlifting
Yeah.
and they tend to become strength coaches.
Yeah.
and and as a result, they then, and we talk about this all the time, I call it the kind of beer and ice cream philosophy, right? You give them what you like. I like beer and ice cream.
Hmm.
But I realize beer and ice cream isn't for everybody. In strength and conditioning, we have lots of what I would call beer and ice cream coaches who are just looking and thinking, hey, this was great for me. And a lot of times it was great for me when I was a football lineman, or it was great for me when I played fullback at X school. And as a result, it's going to be great for you for soccer, or it's going to be great for you for lacrosse, or it's going to be great for you for whatever. And you do struggle with buy-in.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned rugby because even in rugby, I was working with the Bermuda Sevens team for the last couple years, and even sevens is a completely different game to normal 15s rugby, where you have a lot of the more bigger guys and things like that. So even training the different types of players in that is you can see the difference.
And the one thing I realized very early on is that your real athletes didn't love the powerlifting style approach. The
Hmm.
difference was what we did as strength and conditioning coaches is we badmouthed them and we said, "Oh, they're soft." Instead of realizing, I started looking at that and thinking, "Wow, these really high neural guys." Some people are calling them fascially driven now. Some people are calling them narrow infrasternal angle guys, whatever it is. But I would call them the real neural guys. The
Yeah.
real neural guys tend to not love heavy strength training because I think they realize that there's a dampening effect to the nervous system.
Hmm.
And they're going to be much more inclined to want to sprint and jump and do unilateral work than, say, the average big lineman type who's going to be very geared towards heavy strength training. And that person, that the bigger guy, is probably going to benefit more because just pure strength is going to help them overcome their significant body mass. Whereas sometimes, and everybody's seen this, but you see these guys all the time that just can fly, and they're really not very good in the weight room. And our logic is always, oh, if they just lifted, they'd get better. And again, I have all my lame analogies, but I love. I tell people all the time, go and look up Usain Bolt on YouTube and watch his strength training.
Yeah, it's funny.
You watch his strength training and you think, my God, how did this guy ever get to be the fastest man in the world? His strength training program is archaic.
Yeah.
What that reinforces for me is, yes, it's archaic. It's also probably not as important as we think it is. Because here's a guy who's not doing that part very well, yet is still setting world records that people aren't close to. So he doesn't
Yeah.
have, like, number two is not very close to number one in that area. And yet I look at it, I think the average strength coach would be like, man, give me Usain Bolt. I'll put him on my program. He'll be the fastest man in the world. And then you're like,
Willie.
he already is the fastest man in the world. So that not a lot of water in that bucket.
Have you, speaking of track athletes, have you worked with a lot of track athletes, or do you not get much up where you are?
We don't get as many now, but I've worked with quite a few. When I was first at Boston University, we had some amazing track athletes. We had at one point when I was first there, we had 3 7-foot high jumpers, and we
Wow.
might have been the only school in America that had 3 7-foot high jumpers. One was from England. One was one might have been either Bermuda or the Bahamas, I forget, and one was an American kid. And then we had two of the better shot put, weight event guys in the country too. We would historically place in the top 10 in the NCAA's indoors with only 5 guys going.
Yeah. And even taking a bit from track into field and court sports and every other, how has your approach to speed and speed training, or adding in speed to your program kind of changed in the last, let's say, 5 to 10 years?
Well, it's changed. One, I was always heavily influenced by my biggest influence was a throw coach, a guy named Mike Boyle, who ended up working in the NFL for a long time, but was uh, a thrower at Boston College. So I've always looked at kind of the speed and power piece as more important than the strength piece. And this is going back, really, we started doing this in the late 70s, 78, 79. And so we were doing plyos, we were running sprints. But what happened, the big change for me was Tony Holler. I don't know if you're familiar with Tony,
Yeah.
but Tony basically said that if you're not timing, you're not really doing speed training. And I
Hmm.
thought that was really interesting because in track, you're always timing. Every time you have a meet, you time. You get very direct feedback. Did my training program work? If my training program worked, I will have run a faster time.
Hmm.
In strength and conditioning, say at the collegiate level or at the professional level, I think we were a little bit afraid of timing because we equated timing with hamstring injuries. So we would do sprint drills and do sprints, quote unquote. But the harsh reality, as I came to realize it, and this goes, I'm going to say 5, 6 years ago, is that you can't get somebody faster when you don't know how fast they are.
Hmm.
So if someone comes to me and says, Mike, I want to get faster, then I need to get, let's just say, because for us, the barometer is the fly 10. I need to get a fly 10 time on this person so that I can then evaluate, are they in fact getting faster? If they are not getting faster, then I have to look at this and think, hey, what we're doing isn't working. So even now, today we had our guys in, and we're in a kind of a complex training phase where we're pairing some jumps and some strength work. And we've got to be looking and saying, what are our sprint times like? What are our vertical jumps like, to let us know whether are we in an overreaching period? Because I think what happens sometimes is we start to train guys into a decline and then just keep going.
Hmm.
So what I try to do now is I try to look really carefully at what we're doing from a speed perspective and from a power perspective and say, okay, I don't want any declines. I'm fine if we get some flat lines through certain portions of the training, but we should get some PRs. As we start to maybe, deload or change phases, we should see, okay, I got a couple of PRs here. I got a couple of best vertical jumps. I got a couple of best uh, fly tens as we're looking to gain strength. Because what happens sometimes is we get guys, oh, think they're a lot stronger, but they're slower.
Hmm.
And I would look at that and be, I don't know. Maybe in a collision sport, I might trade a little of that, but I don't think I'd trade very much.
So if we essentially, went by the book, you develop strength and muscular capacity before you're strong enough to do plyos or sprint or anything like that. Do you follow that same progression, or are
I
you kind of day
That's one of the
one?
dumbest things. Yeah, one of the dumbest things anybody's ever said
Yeah.
was this idea that you need to have a certain strength level before you can do plyos. That makes no sense at all. We never did that because now I would think there is a requisite or maybe a recommended strength level for really aggressive linear plyometrics, but to look and think the other thing too, and I'll go back a step. I don't think a lot of what we do in the beginning are in fact plyometrics. So if I
Yeah.
box jump is probably not truly plyometric. If I'm thinking about plyometric as reacting to the ground, if I'm doing these single responses, then I'm probably just doing power training and I'm not doing plyometrics. So I think if you're a real purist, you might be able to say, yes, we do need a certain strength level before we're going to do plyometrics.
Hmm.
But I think it's much lower. And again, I think it probably applies more to the less elastic, less neural, less fascially driven guys. So, yes, if I've got some football linemen, American football linemen, and they weigh 300 pounds, and I'm thinking I want to do repeat hurdle jumps with them,
Hmm.
that might not be a great idea if they don't have fairly good strength to body weight ratios. Whereas if you gave me the wide receiver group and said, yeah, none of these guys can squat double body weight, I'd be like, who cares? Watch them bounce around and they're going to be fine. So again, I think what happens is people say things and then other people repeat them. And then eventually they become hard and fast rules when in fact they should never have been hard and fast rules. They should have been things that maybe you might look at them and think maybe guidelines, maybe
Hmm.
recommendations that again should be taken either grain of salt with some context in terms of who's saying this and what is their experience. If it was somebody who said, "Hey, I do primarily American football and I do it at the Division 2 level where I've got athletes that are maybe not as great," then I might find that only my skill position players are going to do well with true plyometrics if we came right out of the gate
Hmm.
with those.
Hmm.
So I just think we have to be careful. And everybody always, I'm an absolute guy, so I'm probably as bad as anybody in terms of absolutes. But I think we just have to be careful with rules.
Are you even with some of your more trained athletes when they say your collegiate athletes that come back for summer? Is that first phase of their plyo progression going to be the same no matter how advanced they have been before?
Always, always, we're always going to stick our jumps, and that's really
Yeah.
interesting because again, if you look at some of the more recent research, when I start looking at guys like Jake Tura, who are starting to do a lot of look at tendons,
Hmm.
I would look at those initial sticking the landing phases as tendon prep. Because what I really want to do is get those tendons ready to react. I want them to be properly prepared to react. Because the interesting thing when you look at the tendon research is we know that the highest stress on the tendon is that transition from eccentric to concentric. So when you're trying to lessen that amortization phase, when you're trying to say to somebody, hey, I want that bouncy feeling, that's the highest tendon stress that you can get. So if we say to somebody, hey, we're going to box jump up. Even now, Hunter Eisenhower is a young guy who's had a pretty big influence on me lately, making me think about physics and about force. We put depth jumps, which we would have looked at, or depth drops. We would have looked at that as a phase 5 plyo. Now we've made it a phase 1 plyo, but
Hmm.
we've modified it so they're not super high drops. Where the drops tend to be about 10% more than the highest vertical jump. So we're going for a small amount of overload And then we've done the same thing that we do with everything else. We progress to unilateral. So say last week we're in week, this is this is week 8 for my son and his friends, for my
Hmm.
college group. And now we're doing single leg depth drops. But again, we started out, let's say we started at around 30, 36 inches for double leg. Then we wanted to see, okay, how's this going to work? We went 18 inches for single leg, which
Hmm.
would have been half, 50% of what we were doing in the bilateral area. And it was clearly too easy. So we went 21. We put a 3 inch on top of the 18. 21 was still easy. Last week we went 24, and 24 was about right. But if you think if we made it the bilateral equivalent, now we're probably getting the equivalent depth drop of a 48-inch box coming down, because we're coming
Hmm.
off of 24 and we're creating a unilateral landing. Again, I like to look at some of the work that people do. Hunter Eisenhower, one of the things that he had said in he's doing similar stuff to Natera in terms of he's force plating himself, he's force plating his athletes, and he was seeing that the highest force, not power, but force, was in the unilateral depth drop. So if he was seeing 10,000 newtons in a bilateral, he was seeing 6,000 in a unilateral. So
Hmm.
we're going to do the same thing that we've always done, is we're going to pursue the unilateral a little bit more aggressively.
Yeah, actually, I had Hunter on a couple months ago after that article that he posted. So I've also been trying to figure out the best way to incorporate some of that into what I'm doing. As far as you said something interesting there, when the single leg landing that was too easy, how did you judge where was like for I know you use like kind of a Goldilocks zone. How did you judge that the 24-inch box was that good? Was it a little no knee valgus or a little bit, or you saw them kind of struggling?
Yeah, it was all the above. So
Okay.
we looked, like I said, 18 right away. Everybody did 18, and the guys, and the good thing is my college guys have been with me for a really long time. So they're pretty good barometers. Some of them have been
Yeah.
with me. My son is 19. He's been there since he was 10. So I can look at that. Is that easy? And they kind of be like, yeah, like way too easy.
Yeah.
So then we said, okay, let's go up 3 inches. 21. Easy. Yeah, it's still really easy. We went to 24 and it was like easy. And they were like, yeah. But when you're looking at them, you say, no, it's not that easy.
Yeah.
Not as simple as 18 was, not as simple as 21 was. I don't think we'll get to 30 drops, truthfully. I think we'll probably stay at 24, and then we may try to go 24 into a re-hop, really, not a re-jump, because we're going unilateral. So we may go 24 down, boom, and then try to bounce over 6. And it's the same thing. So when we did it, where we did some bilateral into a re-jump, and we went 12 inches, and it was okay, too easy. 18 was pretty good. So I think some of it, as you said, Goldilocks, right? I mean, how do you know if the porridge is the right
Yeah.
temperature? Well, you try one and you realize, ooh, that's steaming. I got to blow on that. That's too hot. And you look at the other one and you try, you're like, oh, that tastes nasty because it's cold. And then you think, oh, this one right in the middle is just right. That's coaching. And I don't think someone can feed you coaching through the internet. You got to take whatever it is, athletes, guys, girls, whatever, out and do it, and then see, okay, how does this work in the real world?
Do you use any sort of RSI with any of your athletes, or have you ever?
It's funny, we've played around with it on the Just Jump mat, and really interesting. Uh, Rob, I don't know if I'm going to butcher his name, but Assisi, I think is how you pronounce his last name. He's a jumps coach, really smart guy. And one of the things that he said is when you start looking at RSI, particularly multi jump, it's almost a skill. And what we found is it's a skill.
Yeah.
There are guys that are going to be able to multi bounce in place and do it really, really well, lock up their ankles well. And then there are other guys that don't do it well. But when we do it in a linear sense, we don't see that. So that same guy doesn't struggle single leg hopping 5 consecutive hurdles.
Yeah.
And I don't know what the reasoning behind that is, but I tried that a long time ago. If you look up, I wrote an article a long time ago about elasticity versus power, and trying to think about how we train for elasticity. How do we train for bounciness?
Hmm.
And it was looking at that kind of RSI test on the just jump mat, what they call the 4 jump test.
Yeah.
And we tried 4 jump over and over again, and we just found some guys were good at it, some guys weren't, and nobody seemed to get a lot better. Some guys just did it better than other guys. And it didn't seem like it was a trainable effect. I guess maybe if you said basketball, volleyball, I might devote more time to it because that's really going to happen where they might have to go up, come down a couple times. But for most team sport athletes, that's never going to happen. So I think you end up spinning your wheels a little bit and wasting some time.
Yeah, I have a plyomet, and so this year, or going back a year or two ago, I just used it just to kind of again see what it's like, test some athletes, and get kind of my own data. And yeah, I found almost zero correlation between this guy's a great counter movement jumper or squat jumper or this strong, but terrible at RSI according to this, and this other guy is terrible at all the other things, but can get a pretty good RSI. And then it's like explaining it to them and everything, especially with younger athletes. Even I just found yeah, it's an interesting one. It can be cool if they enjoy it.
Yep. I have Plyomat too. I just use my Just Jump controllers on the
Okay,
Plyomat, so
got you.
I've switched up to Plyomat. I want to make sure I get my Rich Burnett shout out in there in terms of I love him, the mat and the service. I don't love the Just Jump, but I like the Just Jump controller. So I'm milking old Just Jump controllers to death right now as I use Plyomat.
Yeah, because you can attach the
Rich,
just jump to it, right,
yeah,
and use
it
that.
attaches right to it. It has a Just Jump mode and it works perfect. If anybody has a non-working Just Jump and a control that still works, call Rich and get a Plyomat. There's a good plug for Rich. I get no compensation from Plyomat.
Speaking of technology, is there any other kind of technologies that you use on a regular basis?
Arena gear. The Arena gear timer is so good and so simple. And I think I've been helping them sell a lot of timers because I
Yeah.
say to people all the time, this is such an incredibly simple tool. The problem with it is it was really funny. So we had a Twitter thing last night where somebody was saying, oh, I want to buy a timer, but I want to use it for 5-10-5, and I want to use it for standing start, and I want to use it for flies. And I said, yeah, you're like saying to me, I want to buy a saw, but I want to be able to hammer with it and use it as a screwdriver.
Yeah.
And then what? Then complain that it's not a really good saw. So I said, you need to just buy the Arena gear and realize it's really good for flies and maybe not as good for the other stuff. But we pump out flies. We pump out hundreds a day
Hmm.
with these things, and they're pretty darn foolproof once you figure them out. There's a little bit of working on pairing. We bought 2 scoreboards from them so that kids can see their numbers as they come up, and we use that really extensively. That is something I would tell you now we can't live without it. If someone said, all right, you got to start a strength and conditioning program and you got $500 or $600, I'd be like, okay, buy an Arena gear timer and that's it, and then everything else you fudge.
Yeah, I have an arena gear time. I have one arena and one of the free lap timers. The only reason I got the free lap was because for any of the field sessions where I have to, go out and put them up each time and do stuff, I just traveling with the free lap was easier than the arena gear, and setting them up took a little less time. But if I had to, choose one right now, I have enjoyed using the arena gear just because they can run straight through, straight like one after the other. It's worked great.
Right. No chips.
Yeah,
It's just so easy. I never really tried free lap, and then the price.
yeah,
I mean, the Arena gear price you can't beat the price. It's squeaked up a little bit. It used to be in the low fives, now it's in the low sixes. But even at that price, you can't beat it. You just can't.
Yep. All right, we'll just do a couple more questions because I don't want to take up too much of
Okay.
your time. I know you have an opinion. I've listened to a few of your podcasts where you talk about youth, growth related injuries. And I think a lot of people in this day and age think that they're just a part of the process. They're bound to happen. There's really no avoiding them. Do you share that opinion, or what's your take?
No, absolutely not. All of those injuries are overuse injuries. If we talk about Osgood-Schlatt's disease or Seavers or whatever, we kind of make up names for similar conditions when they're children. So Osgood-Schlatt's is still obviously maybe it's more of a bony problem than
Hmm.
a tendinous problem, but it's a knee overuse situation at the tibial tuberosity. Same thing with Seavers. Seavers is a a Achilles overuse situation, but occurring more at the calcaneus. But if kids are getting this, generally speaking, it's a really strong indicator that they're doing too much. And a lot of parents, and I had a really, Jake Turr did a great podcast with a guy named Rich Willie. So if people want to hear a really good podcast on just on injury in general, listen to the Rich Willie episode with of Jake Turr's Jacked Athlete podcast. But one of the things that Rich said, Rich was one of these guys who just said a lot of really smart stuff. But he said, generally, when I see a kid with an overuse injury, I realize I should be treating the parent. And that is the reality, right? You should be going to the parent and saying, it's like, I always look at parents like when someone's, oh, my kid pulled his hamstring or he pulled his groin or his hip hurts. I think, okay, that's really not normal. Kids aren't supposed to pull muscles. Kids aren't supposed to have joint pain. It's not normal. And it is almost always, even if we look at spondies, those types of things, they're all responses to overuse, and they tend to be in an overscheduled young person.
And once it's happens, or once a parent or athlete comes to you, the damage has already been done. How are you approaching their, training from that point on, or even a conversation?
Well, I think you've probably seen me reference, I always reference our My Does It Hurt article.
Yep.
I always tell everybody it's really simple. We just go right to Does It Hurt? And Does It Hurt? I wrote the article a long time ago because when we were doing rehab things with people, they just weren't grasping it. I would say to them, Does it hurt? Is a simple yes, no question. If Liam, if you say to me, I've got a sore knee, I'm going to say, okay, let's do a Spanish split squat.
Hmm.
And we do it. And then I would say to you, Liam, does that hurt? If you look at me and say, nope, feels great. Perfect. Let's load it.
Yeah.
If you look at me and say, well, maybe a little, I'm like, that's yes.
Yep.
Okay. That's not it. Let's regress to something more. Let's regress to a split squat iso or maybe a Spanish split squat iso, something along that line. And let's get you to a very clear, unequivocal, nope, doesn't hurt. And if you do that, your kids will get better, particularly if you give them some rest, get them out of the offending activity, give them something else to do that may be less stressful. And I think if we just let our kids be more seasonal,
Hmm.
we'd be fine. If we said, okay, it's summer. Summer is about beach and about swimming and about bike riding and about all that stuff. Kids would get a lot of time off and a lot of recovery time. But especially, and I don't know where you are, but in the U.S., we have, I always say, we have an adult problem in youth sports in the sense that adults, to get good at something, need to focus and they need to do it a lot. And so when they see their kids, they make the automatic assumption that for my kid to be good at something, he needs to do exactly what I do, which is to really focus and really do it a lot. And the reality is, particularly as the kids are younger, your better generalist probably comes out the other end as a better specialist. So by looking at a kid and saying, and I always use my daughter as an example. My daughter was a very good ice hockey player. But as a kid, she played soccer growing up. She went to gymnastics when she was little. She did judo. She did diving. She did lots of things. And people would marvel at her. In soccer, she'd get tripped and she'd simply somersault, forward roll, land right back up on her feet and keep running. And people would be like, that's crazy. She just got knocked down, did a somersault, got back up, and she still has the ball. And I'm like, yeah, that's gymnastics. That's diving. She's got really good body awareness. And then in hockey, someone would make a bad pass and she'd catch it with her skate and kick it onto her stick. And people would be like, she has such good awareness of her feet.
Hmm.
Why she picks up pucks in her skates. And I was like, yeah, that's soccer. That was her ability to play soccer. So I think when you've got a younger athlete that you want to be good at something specific, you might look and say, I want my kid to be a great soccer player. I would tell you to get them involved in a lot of other activities
Hmm.
because their ability to jump and their ability to sprint and their ability to change direction, it's not just having the ball in their feet all the time. And again, the soccer world, people are saying, yeah, but the Brazilians are the best at soccer. And I say, yeah, the Brazilians don't have options,
Yeah.
right? In Brazil, generally speaking, it's soccer or bust.
Yeah.
In the Dominican Republic, it's baseball or bust. So you can't use countries where there aren't significant options as your proving for the reason why you should specialize.
Hmm.
Because again, And I've done this research over and over and over, talking to professional athletes. If you look at professional athletes in the United States, invariably they were choosing sports in their 13, 14 kind of range. They were thinking, okay, I'm really good at three or four things. I have to pick one that maybe I want to try to do in college.
Yeah.
And that I would literally tell you that in the US environment, unless it was a parent who didn't allow it to happen, most of these kids were picking it.
Hmm. It's funny because it's almost like they think if they don't involve their son or daughter in every possible camp or trip or travel team or extra special session, right, that the other kids are going to get better and their kid is going to not like it's going to water down their development.
And that's the marketing
Hmm.
of the person who wants you to specialize.
Yeah.
The marketing, I always say it's a fear-based marketing. I want to make you afraid that if you don't stay with me year round, your kid will fall behind. I used to, with my daughter, I heard that all the time. I didn't let her play. She didn't play summer hockey until she was 13, which by hockey standards is very, very late. She started late. She started at 8. By 9, she was really good. By 10, she was the best player in her age bracket. And I just wouldn't let her play in the summer. And people would say, "Oh, what about this? What about that? She's going to fall behind." And I thought, nah, I don't really think so.
Yeah.
I think she'll be, I think if she swims and dives and plays a little summer soccer, I think she's going to be fine. And she'd go back to tryouts and bang, she'd still be the best player. And I think a lot of that is strictly marketing, and rich parents, motivated parents,
Yeah.
successful type A parents, they're really easy to market to
Yeah.
because they want, I think everybody, the reality is everybody wants what's best for their kid. Nobody is looking
Yeah.
at their child and thinking, hey, I really want to screw my kid over. I want to do something that's not good for them. But there aren't enough people. And I used to always say there's people like me, and people would say, well, you're looking for their money too. You're absolutely right. I am looking for their money. I'm chasing money the same way everybody else is, but I think I'm chasing it in a much more ethical way by telling people, I want you to train over the summer.
Yeah.
And our training, our training's the cost of 1 week of camp
Yeah.
for most of these kids.
Yeah. Yeah. And you even find with the kids that are hyper specialized, there's so many ways that it can go wrong and very few that it'll end up right. Even just thinking about mental burnout. Like I've only 27, been coaching, 5, 6 years now, and I've already seen in my time a number of my athletes that I can just see are
Oh,
mentally and physically burnt out.
oh yeah. No, it's the psychological, the mental health part is very undervalued in this because again, what are parents doing? Parents are transferring their anxiety
Hmm.
to their children. And then their kids will try to find ways to cope. And that may be alcohol, that may be drugs. There's a lot of things that kids may do to
Hmm.
try to cope with family pressure, parental pressure. So I think you have to be really careful how you, it's not a simple process. I've been very, very lucky. Both of my kids are playing college sports. Both of them are really good athletes, but both were really good multi-sport athletes. My son in his senior year played 3 sports, which people would tell you you can't do. And now he's playing Division 2 lacrosse. If he'd wanted to go to prep school, he could have played Division 1 lacrosse. But he was like, no, I'm going to school right now. And he was a really good high school ice hockey player, and he was a good enough golfer to make the golf team as a senior. But that those are the people that I think the the highest peaks at the end will come from those types of people.
Yeah. Yeah. It's funny. This is more for where I'm based in Bermuda, but the amount of New England prep schools that we send, 12, 13, 14-year-old kids to is insane. There's we being in Bermuda, it's a small island, not as many resources, and there are definitely some outstanding athletes that at some point in their development will have to move on. But at this moment in time, there's so many that I think are just getting essentially marketed to about, come to this prep school and we'll get you into this college with this scholarship and this, that. Meanwhile, you're paying, $50,000 a year just to go to high school then, just to hopefully get a college scholarship. But yeah, it's a, a whole thing.
It is an interesting approach.
But anyway, I just typically like to end things. If you were to give, one or two pieces of advice to whether it's your son or daughter as a youth athlete or anybody else as a youth athlete, so they can best help themselves in their sporting career, what would that be?
Oh, absolutely! Don't specialize. I want to shout it from the rooftops. Don't specialize. Don't let people talk you into specializing. Enjoy the process. Enjoy the fact. Enjoy an off season. Enjoy doing something different, and realize that you'll still be able to get to your desired goal. So that would be the number one thing. And then, honestly, pay attention in school. Read, because ultimately, all this stuff is going to come to an end, and it's going to be you're going to have to get a job. We're all going to have to go to work. So if you weren't paying attention, if you put all your eggs in the sports basket, sometimes you're going to realize at the end that you don't have a lot to show for it.
Yep, great piece of advice. Well, I do want to say a very big thank you. I've obviously listened to your stuff and been a subscriber to everything that you do since I was in college and doing my degrees and things like that. So I do want to say thank you, one, for coming on the podcast, and two, for all the work that you do in the field. I really do appreciate that, as do most.
Well, thank you. I enjoy doing this, and I love talking to coaches, young coaches particularly. So thank you for having me.
Is there anywhere you want to direct people before we hop off?
Actually, and if they're listening to this podcast, I did a product probably 5 or 6 years ago called Complete Youth Training,
Hmm.
where through Athletes Acceleration, I think if you go to completeyouthtraining.com, or if you just type in Complete Youth Training in the internet, it's going to pop up. It's about I want to say it's probably 4 hours of lecture and then 4 hours of practical, showing you really what we're doing.
Hmm.
So that would be a really good spot for somebody who's interested in youth training who listening to this. If you're a coach, strengthcoach.com, I always say this all the time, but strengthcoach.com is the best deal in the industry in terms of it's 15 bucks, 14.95 a month, and you can ask as many questions as you want, and we're putting up answers to your questions with video. It's probably the most underutilized thing that I'm involved in.